Jake Harrison wiped the sweat from his face and looked at his scanner again. The numbers were all wrong. This part of the desert should not have any rare metals, but his machine kept beeping. He had been walking in the crimson wastes for 3 hours, and the sun was getting hotter. The red sand stretched out in every direction. Jake could see nothing but rocks and dust for miles. He was far from the mining camp where he worked. Too far, maybe, but the scanner kept making noise, telling him there was something valuable buried here. Jake was 28 years old and had been working on this planet for 2 years. Before that, he was a soldier and a medic. He knew how to take care of hurt people, but now he just looked for metals and stones that the company could sell. It was safer work, but sometimes boring. He stopped walking and checked his water bottle. Half full, that was good. The desert was dangerous, and water was life out here. The temperature would reach 140 degrees before noon. After that, walking outside without protection would kill a person in minutes. His radio crackled. Jake, this is base. How are you doing out there? Jake picked up the radio. I'm fine. Danny found something interesting about 15 mi south of camp. Might be worth checking out. Don't stay out too long, Danny Mitchell said. Danny was his best friend and worked in the control room. Weather says it's going to be a hot one today. I'll be careful, Jake said. He put the radio back on his belt and kept walking. That was when he saw the streak of fire across the sky. At first, Jake thought it was a meteor. They were common on this planet, but this fire was moving wrong. It was too slow and too controlled. As Jake watched, the fire grew bigger and brighter. Then he heard the sound. It was not the whistle of a falling rock. It was the scream of metal tearing apart. Jake had heard that sound before. During the war, it was the sound of a ship crashing. The fireball hit the ground about 10 mi away. Jake felt the impact through his feet. A huge cloud of dust and smoke rose up from where it landed. Even from this distance, Jake could see pieces of metal flying through the air. Jake stood still for a moment. His training told him to call base and report what he saw. That was the smart thing to do. That was the safe thing to do. But something else inside him, something deeper, told him to go help. He had been a medic. He had saved lives. If someone was hurt in that crash, they would need help fast. By the time a rescue team came from base, it might be too late. Jake checked his supplies: water, medical kit, emergency shelter, and food for 1 day. Not much, but it would have to do. He turned toward the crash site and started walking fast. Closer he got, the more he could see. It was definitely a ship, but not a human ship. The metal was silver and blue, twisted into shapes that hurt to look at. The design was all wrong, with curves and angles that no human engineer would make. Jake had never seen an alien ship before, but he knew that was what this had to be. The human colony on this planet was small, and they would have known if one of their ships was missing. This was something else, something from the stars. As he got closer, Jake could smell burning metal and something else, something sweet and sharp, like electricity in the air after lightning strikes. The ship was huge, maybe 200 feet long. Parts of it were buried in the sand and other parts stuck up like the ribs of a dead animal. Jake moved carefully around the wreck. There might be dangerous radiation or chemicals leaking from the ship, but his scanner showed nothing harmful, just the usual background radiation that all spaceships Carried, he found the first body near what looked like it might have been a door. The alien was tall, maybe 7 ft, with gray skin and 4 arms. It wore some kind of armor that was now cracked and broken. Jake checked for a pulse, but the alien was clearly dead. Its neck was bent at an impossible angle. Jake found 2 more bodies as he walked around the ship, all dead, all wearing the same kind of armor, soldiers maybe, or guards. Then he heard something. Soft moan, barely louder than the wind. Jake stopped and listened. There it was. Again, someone was alive in there. Jake found a hole in the side of the ship, big enough to crawl through. Inside the ship was dark and filled with smoke. Strange lights flickered on and off. The air smelled like burned plastic, and that same electric smell from outside. Jake used his flashlight to see. The inside of the ship was like nothing he had ever seen. The walls curved in impossible ways, and there were no right angles anywhere. Controls and screens covered every surface, but they were all dark now. He followed the sound of moaning deeper into the ship, in what might have been the center of the ship. Jake found her. She was clearly female, though like no woman Jake had ever seen. She was tall, maybe 7 ft like the others, but her skin was not gray. It was blue, like crystal or deep water. Her hair was long and silver, spread out around her head like liquid metal. She wore clothes that looked like they were made of light itself, but they were torn and bloody. Now she was trapped under a piece of the ship's ceiling. Her left leg was bent wrong, and there was blood coming from her mouth, but she was breathing. She was alive. Jake knelt down next to her. "Hey," he said softly, "can you hear me?" Her eyes opened. They were gold, like coins or sunlight. She looked at Jake with surprise and fear. She tried to say something, but it was not in any language Jake knew. The words sounded like music mixed with static. "It's okay," Jake said. He held up his hands to show he was not dangerous. "I'm here to help." She tried to move, but the metal piece was too heavy. Jake could see that her leg was broken, maybe in several places. She needed medical help fast, or she would die. Jake looked around the ship. There were no other survivors, no working radio equipment, no way to call for help. His own radio would not work this far from base. The alien woman looked at Jake with those gold eyes. She was scared, but she was also trying to be brave. Jake could see that she was someone important. Her clothes were too fine, her jewelry too expensive for her to be a regular soldier. Maybe she was an officer. Maybe she was something more. Jake made his decision. He could not leave her here to die. It did not matter that she was alien. It did not matter that helping her might be dangerous. She was hurt and he was a medic. That was all that mattered. "I'm going to get you out of here," Jake told her. She probably could not understand his words, but maybe she could understand his tone. "I'm going to help you," Jake started planning how to move the metal piece and get her free. Outside, the sun was getting higher and hotter. Soon the desert would become deadly. But Jake Harrison had made his choice. He was going to save her no matter what it cost him. It took Jake 30 minutes to free the alien woman from the wreckage. The metal piece was heavy, but he used a broken pipe as a lever to lift it enough for her to slide out. When she was free, Jake could see how badly hurt she really was. Her left leg was definitely broken. Jake had seen enough broken bones to know, but that was not the worst part. She was bleeding inside. He could tell by the way she breath and the color of her skin. Without proper medical care, she would die in a few hours. Jake tried to use his radio again, but it still would not work. They were too far from base, and the crash had probably damaged something. He looked at his water and supplies. Not enough for 2 people to wait for rescue. The alien woman tried to sit up. She said something in her musical language, pointing at herself and then at the dead soldiers outside. Jake thought she was trying to tell him who she was. "My name is Jake," he said, pointing at himself. Then he pointed at her with a questioning look. She understood. She pointed at herself and said something that sounded like Valora. Then she said more words and pointed at the crown-like thing on her head. Even broken and bloody, it looked expensive. Very expensive. Jake realized what she was trying to tell him. She was not just any alien, she was royalty, maybe even a queen. That explained the fancy ship and the guards, but it did not change anything. Queen or not, she was dying. Jake looked at the sun. It was getting higher and hotter. Soon it would be impossible to travel in the desert, but staying here meant death for both of them. The ship's power was gone, so there was no air conditioning. The metal would heat up like an oven. He had to get her to the human base. It was 90 mi away through some of the worst desert on the planet. No person had ever walked that far in this heat and lived, but it was their only chance. Jake started gathering supplies from the wreck. He found some metal pieces that he could use to make a stretcher. The aliens had some kind of fabric that was stronger than anything humans made. Jake used it to tie the stretcher together. While he worked, Balara watched him. She seemed confused by what he was doing. She said something and pointed toward the desert, then shook her head. Jake thought she was telling him it was impossible. She was probably right, but Jake had learned something during the war. Sometimes impossible was the only choice you had. He found some containers that might hold water. They were empty now, but Jake filled them from his own bottles. It was not much, but it would have to do. He also found some alien food packages. He could not read the writing, but food was food. When Jake was ready, he showed Vitera the stretcher. She shook her head and said something that sounded angry. She pointed at herself, then at the ground. She was telling him to leave her here. "No," Jake said firmly, "I don't leave people behind. That's not who we are." She could not understand his words, but she could hear the determination in his voice. Jake carefully lifted her onto the stretcher. She was heavier than a human woman would be, but not too heavy for him to pull. Jake took one last look around the crash site. He memorized the location so rescue teams could find it later. Then he started walking toward home. The first hour was not too bad. The sun was still low enough that the heat was bearable. Jake pulled the stretcher behind him and Valara stayed quiet, but Jake could see she was in pain. Every bump and rock made her WSC. By the second hour, the temperature was over 100 degrees. Jake had to stop every few minutes to rest. He shared his water with Tara, even though he knew it meant they would run out faster. Tara tried to refuse the water. She pointed at Jake and then at the desert, shaking her head. She was trying to tell him to save the water for himself, but Jake just smiled and made her drink. During one of their rest stops, Belterra pointed at Jake and said something. Then she pointed at the desert and made a motion like cutting her throat. She was asking why he was willing to die for Jake thought about how to answer. How could he explain that humans helped each other, that leaving someone to die was wrong, even if that someone was an alien? In the end, he just pointed at his heart and then at her. Some things did not need words. As the day got hotter, Jake had to think of new ways to protect them both. He used pieces of the alien fabric to make shade. During the worst heat of midday, they had to stop completely and hide under Jake's emergency shelter. The shelter was only big enough for one person, but Jake made it work for two. He and Tara lay close together in the tiny bit of shade. The May temperature outside was over 130 degrees. Now, without the shelter, they would cook in minutes. Valara was getting worse. Her breathing was shallow and her skin was turning darker blue. Jake gave her more water and tried to make her comfortable. He used his medical training to check her pulse and watch for signs of shock. While they waited for the heat to die down, Valara started talking. Jake could not understand the words, but he could tell she was telling him stories, maybe about her home or her people. Her voice was beautiful, even weak as it was. Jake talked back to her. He told her about Earth and his family. He told her about the war and why he became a medic. He told her about the human colony and how they were trying to build a new life on this harsh planet. Neither of them understood the other's words, but somehow they were communicating. They were sharing who they were and where they came from. They were becoming friends. When the sun started to get lower, Jake packed up the shelter. They had to keep moving. Every hour they stayed still was an hour closer to death. The afternoon was harder than the morning. The sand was so hot it burned through Jake's boots. He had to wrap his feet with strips of fabric to keep walking. Felter's condition was getting worse and the stretcher was getting harder to pull, but Jake did not give up. He could not give up. Every time he wanted to stop, he looked at Valara and remembered his promise. He would get her home. He would save her life. As the sun started to set, Jake found a good place to camp for the night. It was a small group of rocks that would give them some protection from the wind. He set up the shelter again and made Valara as comfortable as possible. The Tour desert at night was almost as dangerous as the desert during the day. The temperature would drop to near freezing without proper protection. They could freeze to death. Jake had one sleeping bag. He put Valara inside it and then lay down next to her. She was shivering from cold and shock. Jake used his own body heat to keep her warm. During the long cold night, Jake stayed awake and watched over her. Sometimes she called out in her sleep, probably dreaming of home. Jake held her hand and talked to her softly until she calmed down. By morning they had been traveling for one day and had covered about 20 m, 70 mi to go. Jake's water was already half gone and he was feeling the effects of dehydration. His lips were cracked and his head hurt, but Valara was still alive. That was all that mattered. As the sun came up, Jake prepared for another day of walking through hell. He checked their supplies and planned their route. The hardest part of the journey was still ahead of them. Jake looked at Valara. She was awake and watching him with those gold eyes. She said something softly and Jake could tell it was thank you in her language. Jake smiled and started pulling the stretcher again. He had made a promise and he was going to keep it. Day 2 was worse than day 1. Jake's body was already pushed to its limits. But he kept walking. His feet were covered in blisters that had burst and bled into his socks. Every step hurt. But he did not stop. Valera was getting weaker. The internal bleeding was getting worse, and Jake could see that. She was dying slowly. She tried to tell him to leave her behind, but Jake pretended not to understand. He would not abandon her. The sun was even hotter on the second day. Jake's thermometer read 142 degrees in the shade. There was no shade except what they made for themselves. The air itself seemed to burn when they breathed it. Jake had to rest more often now. His water was running low, and he was showing signs of serious dehydration. His hands shook, and sometimes he saw things that were not there, but every time he thought about quitting, he looked at Tara and found the strength to keep going. During their midday rest, Tara grabbed Jake's arm. She looked into his eyes and spoke for a long time in her musical language. Jake could tell she was trying to explain something important. She pointed at herself, then at the ground, then she pointed at Jake and toward the direction of the human base. She was begging him to leave her and save himself. Jake shook his head. No, he said firmly. We go together, or we don't go at all. Bella looked frustrated. She did not understand why this human would throw away his life for a stranger. In her culture, the strong survived and the weak were left behind. That was the natural way. But Jake was showing her a different way, a human way. On the afternoon of the second day, Jake made a terrible discovery. One of his water containers had a crack in it. Half of their remaining water had leaked out into the sand. Now they had maybe 1 day's worth of water left, and they were still 50 meters from safety. Jake stared at the empty container and felt despair for the first time. The math was simple. They could not make it, not both of them, maybe not either of them. But then he looked at Valera, and his resolve hardened. Math was just numbers. Humans had beaten impossible odds before. They would do it again. Jake rationed their remaining water even more carefully. He gave most of it to Velter and took only tiny sips for himself. She tried to refuse, but Jake was stubborn. He had made his choice. That night the cold was brutal. Jake's body was shutting down from dehydration and exhaustion. He could barely keep himself warm, but he still wrapped himself around Valera to keep her alive. She was unconscious now, breathing in short, painful gasps. Jake talked to her all night, even though she could not hear him. He told her about his childhood on Earth. He told her about the ocean and the forests and the cities full of people. He told her about human music and art and literature. He wanted her to know what his species was like, what they had created and loved. By the third morning, Jake could barely stand. His vision was blurry and his tongue was swollen from thirst, but Vila was still breathing, and that meant he had to keep going. Jake tried to pull the stretcher, but his legs gave out. He fell face first into the sand and lay there for several minutes, unable to move. This was it. This was how it ended. But then he heard Valera make a sound, a small, weak sound of pain. She was still fighting to live, so he had to fight too. Jake got back on his feet and started walking again, one step at a time, one foot in front of the other. That was all he had to think about, not the miles ahead or the pain in his body. Just the next step. Around noon on the third day, Jake saw something on the horizon. At first, he thought it was another hallucination, but as he got closer, he realized it was real. It was a dust storm, huge and black, heading straight for them. Jake had seen sandstorms before. This one was massive, maybe a mile wide and moving fast. In minutes, it would hit them with winds over 100 mph and sand that could strip flesh from bone. There was nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. The storm would bury them alive. Jake looked at Velara. She was unconscious but still breathing. He had carried her this far. He would not let a storm kill her now. Jake pulled the stretcher to a small depression in the ground. It was not much protection, but it was all they had. He positioned himself over Velara, covering her body with his own. Then he pulled their shelter over both of them and held on tight. The storm hit like a freight train. The wind was so loud that Jake could not hear his own thoughts. Sand and rocks flew through the air like bullets. The shelter tried to tear away from Jake's hands, but he held on with strength he did not know he had. For 3 hours, Jake lay on top of Tara while the storm tried to kill them both. The sand piled up around them, threatening to bury them. Rocks hit Jake's back and legs, cutting through his clothes and into his skin. The wind was so strong it was hard to breathe, but Jake did not let go. He would not let the storm take her. His body was a shield between Velara and the fury of the desert. He absorbed every impact, every cut, every moment of pain. When the storm finally passed, Jake was barely conscious. He was covered in cuts and bruises, and sand had gotten into every wound. But Tara was alive underneath him, protected by his sacrifice. Jake tried to sit up, but his body would not obey. He had given everything he had and more. The storm had taken the last of his strength. Velara's eyes opened. For the first time in hours, she was awake and aware. She saw Jake collapsed on top of her, bleeding and broken. She understood what he had done. He had used his own body to save her life. Velara said something in her language. Even weak as she was, Jake could hear the amazement in her voice. She had never seen anything like what Jake had just done. In her world, no one would sacrifice themselves for another, especially not for a stranger, especially not for an alien. But this human had done exactly that. He had thrown his body between her and death without thinking twice about it. It was impossible, but it was real. Jake managed to smile at her before his eyes closed. He had done his job. She was alive. That was all that mattered. Velara reached out with a shaking hand and touched Jake's face. She spoke softly in her musical language, and though Jake could not understand the words, he could hear the emotion behind them: gratitude, wonder, and something else: respect. This human had shown her something new, something her people did not have. He had shown her what it meant to put another life before your own. He had shown her what it meant to be truly strong. Jake forced his eyes open one more time. They still had 30 m to go, and he was not sure he could walk another step. But Tara was looking at him with those golden eyes, and he could see something different in them now. She believed in him. She believed that somehow, impossibly, he would find a way to save them both. Jake Harrison was just a human, just a miner and former medic who had happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But to Queen Veltara of the Zephyrian Empire, he was something much more. He was a miracle. Jake woke up to the sound of voices calling his name. For a moment he thought he was dreaming, but then he heard the roar of engines and felt the wind from helicopter blades. Jake Harrison. Can you hear me? It was Danny Mitchell's voice coming through a speaker. Jake tried to sit up, but his body felt like it was made of lead. Everything hurt. His skin was burned from the sun, his lips were cracked and bleeding, and he was so dehydrated he could barely think. But he was alive. And more importantly, so was Vila. Jake managed to lift his arm and wave weakly at the sky. The rescue helicopter circled overhead, and he could see Danny looking down at him through the window. Danny and LT Unc and GTY's face showed shock and relief at the same time. We found them, Danny shouted into his radio. They're alive, both of them. Helicopter landed 50 yards away, kicking up a cloud of dust and sand. Jake watched as Danny and the medical team ran toward them. Dr. Lisa Carter, the colony's chief doctor, was leading the group. My God, Jake, Dr. Carter said as she knelt beside him, what did you do to yourself? Jake tried to speak, but only a croak came out. Dr. Carter immediately started checking his vital signs while the other medics examined Velara. Severe dehydration, heat exhaustion, multiple cuts and bruises. Dr. Carter said to her team, get an IV started right now. And be careful moving him. What about the alien? One of the medics asked. Dr. Carter looked at Velara, who was conscious but very weak. Same treatment. Dehydration and what looks like internal injuries. She needs surgery as soon as we get back to base. They loaded both Jake and Velara into the helicopter. As they flew back to the colony, Jake held Tara's hand. She looked at him with those golden eyes and squeezed his fingers weakly. No words were needed. They had survived together. The next few days were a blur for Jake. He spent most of the time sleeping while his body recovered from the ordeal. When he was awake, Dr. Carter made him drink fluids and eat small amounts of food. His feet were so damaged from walking 90 mi in the desert that he could not stand for a week. But Jake was more worried about Velara than himself. Dr. Carter had operated on her to stop the internal bleeding, and the surgery had been successful, but she was still very weak, and no one knew if alien biology would respond the same way as human biology to their medicines. On his 4th day in the medical center, Jake was finally strong enough to walk to Tara's room. He found her sitting up in bed, looking much better than when they had been rescued. Her blue skin had returned to its normal color, and her golden eyes were bright and alert. When she saw Jake, her face lit up with joy. She said something in her musical language that Jake was sure meant hello or how are you feeling. I'm okay, Jake said, pointing to himself and nodding. How are you? Velter pointed to herself and nodded too. Then she pointed at Jake and spoke for several minutes in her own language. Her tone was serious and grateful. Dr. Carter came into the room carrying a tablet computer. Jake, you're going to want to see this. We've made some progress with the translation program. For the past few days, the colony's computer experts had been working on translating Tara's language. They had recorded everything she said and were starting to understand the basic structure of her speech. What did she just say? Jake asked. Dr. Carter looked at the tablet. Near as we can tell, she was thanking you for saving her life. But there's more. She keeps talking about something that the computer translates as honor debt or life bond. We think it might be some kind of cultural obligation. Jake looked at Valera, who was watching him intently. What kind of obligation? We're not sure. Yet Dr. Carter said, but she seems to think you've earned something by saving her something important. Over the next few days, as Valera recovered and the translation program improved, the full story began to emerge. Tara was not just any alien, she was Queen Valera, ruler of something called the Zephyrian Star Empire. Her ship had been on a diplomatic mission. When it crashed, more importantly, Jake learned about Zephyrian culture. In their society, strength was everything. The weak were abandoned to die, and only the strong deserved to live. They had never heard of anyone sacrificing themselves for a stranger. She keeps talking about how impossible your actions were, Dr. Carter explained to Jake one morning. In her culture, what you did is literally unthinkable. No Zephyrian would risk their life for someone else, especially not for an alien, but that's exactly what makes it so important to her, added Commander Alex Rodriguez, who had joined their conversation. She says you've shown a kind of strength her people have never seen before. Jake was confused. I didn't do anything special. I just couldn't leave her to die. That's exactly the point, Commander Rodriguez said to her. That makes you the strongest person she's ever met. As Valera got stronger, she began teaching Jake some of her language. While he taught her English, she was a quick learner, and soon they could have simple conversations. Jake, she said one day, her accent making his name sound like music. I must tell you something important. What is it? Jake asked. Valera looked serious. In my culture, when someone saves your life at cost of their own, they earn the right to marry into the royal family. You have earned the right to marry me. Jake nearly choked on his water. What you showed the greatest courage possible, Valera explained. You risked death to save me. In Zephyrian law, this makes you worthy of being my husband. Jake stared at her. Valera, I appreciate the honor, but I didn't save you because I wanted to marry you. I saved you because it was the right thing to do. Valera looked puzzled. You expected no reward. No reward, Jake confirmed. Where I come from, we help people because they need help. That's all. This seemed to shock Velter even more than Jake's original rescue. She sat quietly for a long time, thinking about what he had said. Your people do this often, she finally asked. Risk themselves for strangers with no thought of reward. Jake nodded. All the time. It's what we do. Valera shook her head in amazement. My people have studied many species across the galaxy. We have never encountered anything like this. Your species is unique. Over the following days, Veltara spent her time learning everything she could about human culture and history. She read about human wars where soldiers died to save their friends. She learned about firefighters who ran into burning buildings to rescue strangers. She studied stories of humans who gave up their own lives to protect others. This is not rare among your people, she said to Jake one day. This sacrifice for others, it is common, pretty common. Yeah, Jake agreed. Velter was quiet for a moment. Jake, I must ask you something. If you will not marry me, what do you want as reward for saving my life? Jake thought about it. I don't want anything, but if you really want to give me something, help us understand each other, help humans and Zephyrians become friends. Valera smiled, and Jake realized it was the first time he had Seen her truly happy. Yes, she said. Yes, I think that would be a very good reward indeed. 3 weeks after the rescue, Velara was fully recovered and ready to return to her people, but she was not the same alien queen who had crashed in the desert. Her time with the humans had changed her in ways she was still trying to understand. Jake found her in the colony's small library, reading everything she could about human history and culture. Books and data tablets were scattered around her chair, and she had filled several notebooks with her own observations. Find anything interesting? Jake asked. Sitting down across from her, Velara looked up from a book about World War. Aye, your species fought a war where 50 million people died. Yet you still have stories of enemies saving each other's lives, soldiers risking everything to help wounded enemies. How is this possible? Jake shrugged. We're complicated, I guess. We can be violent, but we also believe that some things are more important than winning or losing, such as life, compassion, the idea that everyone deserves a chance to live. Velara shook her head in wonder. My people would call this weakness, but I have seen what your weakness can accomplish. You carried me 90 m through a desert that should have killed us both. That is not weakness. That is the strongest thing I have ever witnessed. A few days later, a Zahirian rescue ship arrived to take home. Jake watched as the sleek silver vessel landed near the colony. It was beautiful and clearly advanced, but somehow cold compared to the human buildings around it. Velara's people were surprised to see their queen healthy and unharmed. They had expected to find her body in the desert. When they learned that a human had saved her, they were skeptical. Impossible, said High Counselor Zethran, Velara's chief advisor. No alien would risk their life for one of us. What did this human want in return? Nothing, Beltara said simply. Zethran looked confused. Nothing? Then why did he save you? Because that is what humans do, Beltara replied. They help those who need help. Beltara asked Jake to meet with her advisors before she left the colony's main conference room. She introduced Jake to the Zapirian delegation. This is Jake Harrison, she announced. The human who saved my life. The Zafirians looked at Jake with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. He was clearly just an ordinary human, not tall or strong-looking, not wearing any fancy clothes or medals. How could this unremarkable person have done something so extraordinary? Tell them what you told me, Tara said to Jake. Tell them why you saved me. Jake felt uncomfortable being the center of attention, but he answered honestly. She was hurt and needed help, that's all there was to it. The Zafirians translated Jake's words among themselves. They seemed to be having a heated discussion. Finally, Zethran spoke to Velara. My queen, with respect, this human story makes no sense. No rational being acts without expecting something in return. What is he really after? Beltara stood up. Counselor Zethran, I have spent 3 weeks studying human culture. I have learned that what Jake did is not unusual for his species. Humans regularly sacrifice for strangers. They call it duty or compassion, or simply the right thing to do. Impossible, Zethan insisted. I thought so too, Belara said, but I have seen the evidence. Humans have stories going back thousands of years about individuals who gave their lives for others. It is woven into their culture, their literature, their very identity. She gestured toward Jake. This human carried me through a desert that would kill most beings in hours. He gave me his water when he was dying of thirst. He used his body to shield me from a sandstorm, and when I offered to marry him as reward, he declined. The Zethurian delegation murmured among themselves. This was clearly outside their understanding of how the universe worked. Beltara continued, I propose that we establish a formal alliance with the humans, not because we need their resources or their territory, but because they possess something we lack, something that could make our empire stronger. What could these primitive beings possibly offer us? Zan asked. Loy Velara said simply, think about it. If humans will risk death for strangers, how much more will they sacrifice for allies, for friends? We have spent centuries conquering worlds through force, but humans could show us how to build alliances that will never break. Jake listened to this conversation with growing amazement. He had just done what any decent person would do, and somehow it was changing galactic politics. Your Majesty, Zethran said carefully, even if what you say is true, how do we know this human's behavior represents his entire species? Beltara smiled, because I have studied their history. This behavior is not rare among humans. It is common, expected. They have entire professions built around helping others at personal risk. They call them doctors, firefighters, soldiers, police officers, rescue workers. She walked over to Jake. In our empire, we abandon the weak and let them die. We call this natural selection, but humans have a different approach. They save the weak and make them strong. They refuse to leave anyone behind. Belara turned back to her advisors. I have made my decision. We will establish an embassy here on this world. We will study human culture and learn from their example, and we will propose a formal alliance between our peoples. The next few months were busy ones for the small human colony. The Zapirians built a beautiful embassy near the mining base, and Tara stayed to serve as the first ambassador. She spent her time learning more about human customs and teaching interested humans about Zephyrian culture. Jake found himself in an unusual position. He was still officially just a geological surveyor, but Velara had asked him to serve as a cultural liaison. His job was to help visiting Zapirians understand human behavior and to help humans avoid accidentally offending their new alien friends. It was strange work, but Jake discovered he enjoyed it. He liked meeting the different Zephyrians who came to visit, and he was proud to represent humanity to these advanced aliens. One day, Belara asked Jake to help train a group of young Zahirian soldiers. They were having trouble understanding human military tactics. Your soldiers fight differently than ours, the Zaphiran captain explained. Our forces retreat when outnumbered, but human soldiers often fight harder when their situation becomes hopeless. We do not understand this behavior. Jake thought about how to explain it. We have a saying, leave no one behind. When human soldiers are in trouble, other humans will risk everything to save them. That makes our soldiers willing to fight even when they're outnumbered, because they know their friends won't abandon them. The Zaphiran captain looked puzzled. But if a soldier is wounded or trapped, is it not logical to sacrifice one life to save many? Maybe, Jake said, but humans don't always do what's logical. We do what we think is right, and we think it's right to save our friends, even if it costs Over time, the Zephyrians began to understand. They saw how human rescue teams would risk their lives to save a single trapped miner. They watched human doctors work around the clock to save patients who might die anyway. They observed how human parents would sacrifice anything for their children. Slowly, some of the younger Zephyrians began to adopt human attitudes. They started helping injured comrades instead of leaving them behind. They began to see strength and compassion rather than weakness. A year after the crash, Tara received a message from the Zephyrian home world. The Empire's Council had voted to accept her proposal for a formal alliance with humanity. The humans would provide cultural advisors and humanitarian aid, while the Zephyrians would share their advanced technology and protect human colonies. You did this, Velara told Jake as they watched the sunset from the embassy balcony. One human simple act of kindness has changed the relationship between our species forever. Jake shook his head. I just did what anyone would do. No, Velara said firmly, you did what any human would do, and that makes all the difference. She looked out at the desert where Jake had carried her to safety. I used to think the strong survived and the weak perished. That was the natural way. But you taught me something new. You taught me that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is help someone else become strong. Jake smiled. My grandfather used to say that a society is judged by how it treats its weakest members. Your grandfather was wise, Velara said. I think our alliance will teach my people to be wise as well. As the years passed, the human-Zerian alliance grew stronger. More colonies were established with Zephyrian protection. Human medical techniques saved countless alien lives. Zephyrian technology helped humans explore new worlds, but the most important change was in the Zephyrians themselves. Inspired by human examples, they began to value compassion alongside strength. They developed their own rescue services and medical corps. They stopped abandoning their weak and started helping them grow strong. Jake Harrison never became famous. His name was not written in history books or carved on monuments, but his simple act of human decency changed the galaxy. He showed an alien queen that there was more than one way to be strong, and sometimes that's the most important thing one person can do.